So real quick, my name is Chris Pechacek. I'm the VDC Director for McCarthy Building Companies. I'm in the Northern Pacific Division. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some lessons learned on Kaiser Oakland project that we have that's up north. You heard a little bit about the earlier Kaiser, another Kaiser project from HP where they were talking about, Anaheim and locking down changes and everything else. Well, we're on the other side of the coin. We have, on this particular project, we have a lot of changes. And so we've got to keep up with those changes as we go through. So what I want to talk about is the use of Synchro and how you're approaching your project and how you're planning your project and getting into the operations of things. So a little bit about background. It's about 1 million square feet. It's multiple buildings. We're in phase 2, which is the other big piece of this is that we have a legacy P3 requirement. For those of you who are still dealing with P3 in Synchro, our pain. I'll get into a little bit about that. We have so many models, so much stuff is being coordinated. It is amazing. I mean, all the content and everything else that we have. The other thing too is with healthcare, and my experience with healthcare is that it's driven by the technologies that are in the space. So it's going to constantly change, and you should expect that change and plan for that change. So an approach that we have on this project is we're looking at the full life cycle, that flow of information throughout that project. And this wheel kind of indicates, basically you go through your typical project sequence and your steps. You get into your design model, your trade coordination, your fabrication, your schedule integration, change management, going all the way through capturing that information into a CMMS and CAPM system. Today I want to focus just on these, which is taking your subtrade models. Where are you in your fabrication, your installation, your schedule integration for all the various different systems, means and methods, and then change management. How are you managing those changes throughout the course of the project? Most contracts do not adequately address this. If you go back to pretty much any of the contracts, it's very rare if there's even any attempt on managing the chains of information as you go. So some thought needs to be put into that. And a little bit about field verifications, and that's just statusing work as it's going. So planning for that change, there's impacts of that change that you need to take into consideration. All too often projects kind of kick off, and it turns into a giant cluster because changes are happening at different places, different times. People are on different pages at different times. So there's that time element that has to be taken into consideration when you're doing your planning for that project. Getting that detailed out in the beginning is critically important. That sets you up for success on being able to manage that information of where you are throughout that project. I know HP projects are a little bit different. They don't change. But on our projects, we have lots of changes. For here, just even the hospital building alone, we've got 320-something IVs already, or ACDs as they're called now. And that's just one building alone. We've got, it's to be expected. And you should plan for those changes. And how you're dealing with those changes throughout the course of construction is really important. You've heard a lot about use of Synchro, and you've seen a lot of examples in movies and AVI files and schedules about planning and pre-con. What happens when you actually get into construction and all those best laid plans go awry because the owners change their minds, environmental conditions, city conditions, agency conditions, all those changing impacts that are happening later after the course of construction. And you need to be able to keep up and keep up with those and stay on top of them. So the first pass, I call it the first pass. Really what our objective was during the course of construction was to provide that effective means for the superintendents that we were across 5 different projects to really understand and be able to communicate and collaborate together to understand what each project is doing, when it's doing, how their schedule is impacting each of the other respective projects. Up to this point, it was digging through a gazillion activity IDs in the various different projects and trying to anticipate what was happening, but not really knowing what the impacts from all the different changes were happening. So using Synchro allows you to be able to take all the project schedules and their models, bring them in, and actually walk through that sequence, that flow, to see where you have conflicts between the projects. So when we did this first pass, I'm going to go through what worked, and then I'm going to cover what didn't work, and then what we're going to be doing after. afterwards. You know, what was successful is the integration of distinct separate schedules into one. That works great. It's the only package I know of that actually can even do remotely even come anywhere close, and Synchro does a very, very good job of taking multiple different schedules, multiple different projects, and bringing them into one integrated platform. It's the only package that I know that does that. What it also provided was a team to see what the schedule was saying. I mean, that was huge, because a lot of times you're reading through the schedules and all you see are Gantt charts and CPM and everything else, but you don't really see that scope. This allows you to be able to visually see that scope and understand what's happening and work through those schedule conflicts. And then from there, we took the updates that came out of those coordination sessions on a weekly basis with the superintendents, their inter-project coordination meeting, and those updates were then pushed back to P3. Okay. So here's an example of just showing a location that's between the cup on the lower left, the podium on the hospital lower right, hospital tower in the middle, and then the specialty MOB, which is on the top right. That space in that congested area had all projects happening and having activities that were in distinct separate project schedules, and they didn't really know what each was doing to the other. So this is an example of that. But what didn't work, and this is what I want to talk a little bit about, is that the P3, anybody who's dealing with P3 knows that it's very, very difficult. It's a dog. Okay, so taking the P3 and the synchronization from Synchro to that P3 was taking anywhere from 5 to 6 hours. And that tied up too much of the staff time, resources, and everything else. So what the team ended up doing was they started taking shortcuts. They started focusing on just certain activities that they knew were key, using just those activities in these coordination sessions, working them out, and then having basically handwritten notes, passing those back to the scheduler for the P3 schedule to get updated. So they broke that cycle, okay, of the bidirectional cycle, and it was a little bit further down the road when we discovered what was going on. Okay, so with that, there was mixed buy-in from the superintendents. Not all the superintendents were really bought into it because they thought it was just another meeting. It was more a workaround. It was, you know, it was great that they could see it, but they really wanted an automated process. Why? Were the issues? P3, as you guys know, there's limitations. 16-bit code only runs on 32-bit computers, so you're also limited on the memory and the processing power that you have with that. Our schedules, because Kaiser wanted more and more detail in those CPM schedules, we're at like 70,000 total activities across the phase 2. That's a lot of activities. And so when you take that amount of detail in your schedule, and you take an infinite amount of detail in the rest of your models, you crash the system. Pretty routinely. And there was a resource limitation, just time. You know, time, staff, everybody's on the go, everybody's hustling, trying to keep up. You know, you can't just dump additional requirements on people that are short on time. So we took a step back, went back to the basics. All right, trying to get everything set up on what we call the supercomputer. It's like 48 gigs of RAM and solid-state hard drives and GPUs and all that kind of stuff, right? I think this went out. So can everybody still hear me? Yep. All right, so on that 64-bit computer, you know, you have XP mode. Anybody here tried running P3 in XP mode? It doesn't work. All right, so it's when you start getting big schedules and everything else, it really bogs everything down. So basically the workaround on that is using VMware. All right, so setting up VMware with the full 32-bit OS is what we recommend. Actually being able to use a P3 and get that synchronization to go, it's much faster, much more stable as well. The other thing we've had to do is break up the model content into manageable file sizes. It doesn't like 150 megabyte files, so on some of the files. So we've broken them down into really what are the distinct groups for planning purposes, for the interiors, exterior site, those kind of different things. Breaking those down, but bringing in the entire schedule, but limiting the scope of the 3D content that was in there. Also setting up the Synchro database module. That helped provide stability. Once that's set up, it didn't crash anymore. So we were able to continue to keep using the information. The other thing we did is we kind of did another Primavera workaround of going P3 to P6, but you guys know there's issues on moving P3 to P6 if you got resource loaded and everything else. So you got to strip all that stuff out and have just a schedule with the logic going from P3 to P6. Bring that into Synchro, do your updates, do your synchronization, push back to P6, back to P3. That reduced that time down to 1 to 2 hours. So we went from 5 to 6 hours to 1 to 2 hours, and we were able to do the full loop, bidirectional loop. What we wanted to do is get back to where we were using the models during our Subtrade coordination meeting. So on a weekly basis, everything is on a weekly cycle from the P3 updates, our full scheduling, location-based scheduling, everything on our project is on a weekly cycle. So we wanted to be able to go back and take these models, bring them back into the Subtrade coordination meetings, and use those during the full schedule meetings. You guys heard a little bit about how much detail. You only need as much detail as you need to schedule. I mean, you don't need to look at every anchor, every bolt, those kind of things when you're doing the scheduling piece of this, just because it is too much detail. So you need to bring in the appropriate level of detail. And then statusing that work, you got different states of changes that are happening, what's been approved, what's not approved, what's been released for fabrication, what's installed. So you're doing your site walks periodically, what's installed, and then what's still planned. And using that, basically those models along with the schedule for your Subtrade coordination meetings. The other thing we did is we took and we customized a next node application, working with Tom and Synchro, and being able to capture this information. As you see over on the left, you see the tags. Those tags have a unique activity ID. They have an activity description, responsible party, duration, and constraints, because it's lean, it's full. So they have constraints, which are really your predecessors. On there is also a generated 2D barcode. You can scan those directly into Synchro with all the information that's there, and you now have the ability to be able to go in and key in the predecessors. Okay, so that way you don't have to go back in the linking and everything else to be able to key that in. Okay, so that helps. Basically, if you're doing your pull schedules during your meetings and you've got a level 3 level of detail on your schedule, and you need to bring in additional detail for your weekly work plans or what you're doing for your 3-week look ahead, 6-week look aheads, you can capture that in your pull schedule meetings, bring that right into Synchro, and you have the information and you can quickly link things up. So in summary, we're still testing, we're still pushing the envelope. We don't like to sit still, so we're always constantly pushing and testing and breaking things, as Tom will tell you. But I think it's good because we're trying to do new things, different things. We're trying to go back to the overall process and integrate this into that process, make the process much more efficient. It's not about technology for the sake of technology. It's about how are you delivering the project more efficiently within the schedule and cost. And I think we've done a hell of a job. We've got, right now, we've got almost 400 total changes on the project across the board, and we have not pushed out the schedule. The end date has not pushed out. We've been able to accommodate those, incorporate them in, and feather those changes in as we go. The internal project conflicts are identified, collaboratively resolved with the team. It's huge. Those are obviously delays that are mitigated. Our internal IT, which is always a challenge of getting our IT, you think that they really would be up on this stuff. We find that we're always challenging them to become more savvy on this, and they're reducing that learning curve for them on deploying to other projects as well. And then using it for interior work. So it's improving the communication, the collaboration with the subtrades on the interior work, which is oftentimes really difficult to do just because of the dynamics of that interior. Group sizes start really growing. You're all over the building. It's a lot easier to do some kind of lean full planning when you're on the exteriors or in foundation or structural steel. When you get into the interiors, that group size gets huge, and it's much more difficult to scale any type of lean full planning, full scheduling that you're doing to that large of a group. And this really helps you be able to do that. So real quick, that's who I am. Any questions? Yes.
I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but on the full planning side, you use the constraints Synchro, but you did track the P6.
The constraints, basically in the lean terminology, the constraints, when you're doing what your activity is and what constraints are precluding you from doing that, you call them constraints because you don't want to call them predecessors in those meetings, because if you call them predecessors, they're going to think and limit their communication to just what's in the schedule as a predecessor. It's a constraint. Most times the constraints aren't even in the schedule. They are in here. You can. So what happens, say, let's use an example of an RFI or a submittal or something like that, and you don't have a distinct activity in your schedule for an RFI or a submittal. Well, what you can do, if you know that you're at risk of that work pushing out, actually create that activity, track who's responsible, when is it due by, who's it getting handed off to, so that way the rest of the work that's internally for GCs, oftentimes we're the ones that are holding things up because it's either an RFI that hasn't been answered that we need to go dog, or a submittal that we need to go, knock on somebody's door, dash to get, something processed and approved. Those kind of things that allows us to do a better job in support of our subtrades.
Yeah, it's not something your schedule or your superintendent really cares about.
And that's just impacting his schedule. If it's impacting their work and they can't start because of those things, then it becomes important. Capturing them in here and doing that focused look ahead, that rolling schedule, that weekly work plan, including that in that weekly work plan, is where now you pick that up, and then you get the choice of whether you roll that up into your CPM or not. Because you obviously don't want to add, you need to keep your CPM at as much of a summary level as you can within that project. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I just being a web guy and doing a coordination meeting, it'd be nice to use this and then track your RFI. In the meeting, it's, well, we got a response back from that RFI or this change or this ASI or whatever.
Right. What's the impact of the response on the RFI? It goes and changes something, or you get submittals that come back and they're changing things. Understanding what the schedule impact, what's been released, what's installed. We've got other things I didn't put it in here just for sake of time because we're on a 30-minute block. But when you know what's already been installed and you've got changes, you can go in there and look at the schedule and say exactly, what's the best option now. If you want to add additional scope in there, what's the best way of actually scheduling and sequencing that in? And we got case examples of that as well. Yes.
How are you statusing 70,000 activities?
Very painfully. Very, very, very painfully. Lots of meetings.
And it's once a month submittal, right?
Well, there's once a month official, but there's weekly submittals. So we're updating the P3 location-based scheduling, and all of our full scheduling is happening on a weekly cycle. Everything gets reported out on a weekly basis. So otherwise, it's too much, and by the time you get to the end of the month, you're lost in the woods. You have to do it on a weekly basis, otherwise you get lost.
So the 70,000 activities, I think, is through the 5 projects.
Yes.
So you have 5 different P3 schedules, and then you roll it up into one P3 schedule separate. Is that right?
They're submitted as separate schedules, but in here, we're bringing them all in for coordination.
In Synchro, it's all 5, it's 70,000. In P3, it's 5 different ones.
Yes.
How many schedules do you have on the team?
2 P3s, 2 P3 guys, 2 location-based scheduling guys, and the full scheduling is, there's one guy who is basically training all the other project engineers and the superintendents to do it as well. So the intent is for everybody to learn this and not to have a separate isolated group. You don't want a separate BDC group or BIM group or department or this or that. You want everybody doing it as part of their operations and their procedures for what they're doing. So you're pushing this out to the superintendents, pushing it out to the project engineers, the APMs, the PMs, and everything else, which is obviously challenging. Everybody complains about it, but they got to get with the times.
I have a question for you guys. How many companies do full scheduling, post-it notes? Good. That's to be expected, right? How many use a post-it note printer? You use Nextnote?
Yeah.
You do. Well, we have an interface, so your barcode dumps directly into Synchro, so you don't have to rekey it. The big gain for these barcode elements on the printed 3D data capture. You want the workshop environment. You want to be able to walk around the room with these Post-it notes. But you also don't want to spend 4 hours rekeying Post-it notes into Excel, as an example, and then sort out the data later. This is as long as it takes to set up your columns correctly in the Gantt chart and Synchro, define your use profiles along with the other data, so you can get custom fields, and then your barcode is red. And we even hunt to the next line. So if you have 300, how long does it take you 300 gunshots? Then that's your data capture. As Chris does this, he puts predecessors, constraints. Constraints become another printout. So you have the activity ready to link to. And now it's just a function of linking.
And it's just another activity as you're going through that with the responsible party, duration, and what do they need to be able to do that.
Believe it or not, they're out of
Utah.
A little place south. What's the city? What's the city here?
Is it Ogden?
Down that
Is it Ogden?
St. George.
St. George.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, out of St. George. He's a clever guy. I think his biggest customer is Cisco.
Yeah, Cisco and then Disney. They've got some other things.